The year was 1877, and the world had shrunk for Amos Blackwood until it was no larger than the four walls of his cabin and the biting circle of his traplines. The land that stretched beyond his door was a vast, northern plains immensity, a place of sweeping grasses that sighed in the wind and a sky so wide it could make a man feel like an afterthought of God. For Amos, this emptiness was not a landscape, it was a mirror. It reflected the hollowed-out chambers of his own heart, a space once filled by his wife, Martha, and a son whose laughter he could now only faintly recall, like a melody heard through a thick fog. His life had become a litany of stark, repetitive motions: the sharp bite of the axe into pine, the metallic snap of a trap, the scrape of a knife against hide, the hiss of coffee boiling over the fire. These sounds were the only language he spoke with any regularity. Silence was his true companion, a heavy blanket he pulled over himself each night, woven with the threads of memory and regret. He was a ghost haunting the architecture of his own past, a man whittled down by grief until only the raw, splintered wood of survival remained. The cabin itself seemed to have absorbed his sorrow. Its timbers were dark with wood smoke and time, its single window a vacant eye staring out at the unforgiving beauty of the wilderness. One morning, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, Amos was checking the farthest reaches of his territory. The air was sharp, carrying the promise of the first deep snow. His canvas coat, worn thin at the elbows, did little to blunt the wind's teeth. In the leather pouch on his belt, there was a single heavy cartridge left for his Sharps rifle. It was a weighty thing, a small, brass-cased piece of insurance against starvation or sudden threat. He had intended it for an elk, if fortune smiled, something to see him through the first brutal weeks of winter. Then he heard it, not the clean crack of a single hunter's shot, but a chaotic volley. 2, then 3 reports, ugly and hurried, tearing the morning's peace to shreds. It was the sound of panicked, clumsy killing. Amos moved with the quiet economy of a predator, his worn boots making little noise on the frosted ground. He crested a low rise, his body shielded by a clutch of weathered junipers, and looked down into a shallow basin. What he saw stopped his breath. A buffalo herd was in full flight, a brown river of panicked flesh pouring over the horizon. But left behind, separated from the thunderous retreat, was a calf. It was a creature of myth, a living legend he had only ever heard of in whispers from the few natives he'd traded with over the years. Its coat was the color of fresh cream, a stark, brilliant white against the dun-colored earth. It was a spirit animal, a sacred messenger, and it was being cornered. 3 men, their faces coarse and flushed with brutish excitement, were closing in. They were not hunters, they were butchers, their movements greedy and loud. They fumbled with their rifles, eager to claim the impossible prize. Amos watched as the small white calf, trembling with fear and confusion, tried to find an escape that wasn't there. Something shifted inside Amos Blackwood. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a decade, a hot surge that had nothing to do with survival or loss. It was a profound sense of wrongness. To see such a thing of power and beauty brought down by such careless men felt like a sacrilege, a stain on the very land itself. He thought of his last bullet, the elk meat he needed, the long, hungry winter ahead. Then he looked at the calf, its white coat seeming to glow with an inner light, and the choice was no longer a choice at all. It was a command from a part of his soul he thought had long since died. He raised the heavy Sharps rifle, the stock fitting into the familiar hollow of his shoulder. He didn't aim at the men. He was not a murderer. He was a man making a statement. He took a steadying breath, let it out, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle boomed, a deep-throated roar that was vastly different from the hunter's frantic shots. A geyser of dirt and rock erupted less than a foot from the lead hunter's boot. The man, who he would later know as Garrett Vance, yelled in shock and stumbled backward. The other 2 froze, their eyes wide, scanning the ridge for the source of the impossibly accurate shot. They saw him, thinner, lone, gaunt figure, standing tall against the grey sky, the massive rifle held with an unshakable stillness. They saw not an old man, but an arbiter. "Leave it be." Amos's voice was a raw, gravelly thing, torn from a throat unused to shouting. The wind carried the words to them, and they carried a weight far heavier than the 3 small syllables. Garrett Vance stared, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He looked from Amos to the priceless white hide and back again. He opened his mouth to shout a threat, but the sight of the old trapper, motionless and resolute on the ridge, choked the words back down. There was a finality in that stance, a clear indication that the next shot, if there was one, would not be a warning. Cursing, Vance gestured angrily to his companions. They backed away, still looking over their shoulders, their greed curdling into resentment. They mounted their horses and rode off, their shouted promises of return poisoning the clean air. Amos remained on the ridge until the sound of their hoofbeats faded completely. He watched as the white calf, finally free, made a distressed call that was answered from over the hill. The mother, a great, shaggy beast, reappeared, and the two were reunited. He watched them disappear into the vastness, rejoining the unseen river of the herd. He lowered the rifle, the silence that descended feeling different now. It was not empty, it was resonant. He was left with an empty gun, a growling stomach, and a strange, powerful warmth spreading through his chest. It was the feeling of a debt paid to something he couldn't name. The following dawn broke cold and clear. The sky was a pale, depthless blue, and the world was rimed in frost that glittered like scattered diamonds. Amos woke to a silence that was deeper than usual. The normal morning chatter of birds was absent. The wind itself seemed to be holding its breath. A prickling sensation ran up his spine, the instinct of a man long accustomed to solitude, an instinct that screamed something had changed. He moved from his cot to the small, grease-papered window and peered out. His heart gave a hard, painful lurch in his chest. They were there, standing in a solemn, silent line at the edge of the clearing that served as his yard. They were not warriors on the raid. Their bearing was entirely different. They were elders, holy men, their faces etched with the wisdom of generations, their presence radiating an authority that felt older than the mountains themselves. He counted 7 of them, each a man of great standing, wrapped in buffalo robes and adorned with the sacred implements of their office. He recognized the styles of different nations, Lakota, Cheyenne, and others he could not name. It was a council, an impossible, terrifying council, assembled at the doorstep of a reclusive white trapper. Amos backed away from the window, his breath catching in his throat. His first impulse was pure, primal fear. He was one man. His rifle, leaning by the door, was a useless iron stick. He slammed the heavy wooden bar across the door, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. He was a prisoner in his own home, his mind racing. Had they misunderstood? Did they think he had tried to kill the calf himself? Or worse, did they think he now held some claim to it, some power he had stolen? He spent the morning moving from the window to the cold hearth, a caged animal. He watched them. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply stood, their dark eyes fixed on his cabin, their stillness a force more potent than any threat. The sun climbed the sky, a cold, impartial witness. The hours stretched into an eternity. This was not an attack. It was a vigil, a test. They were waiting. The leader, a Lakota man with a face like a weathered rock carving and eyes that held the deep, star-dusted black of the night sky, eventually sat. He did not sit on the ground, but on a painted buffalo robe his companion laid out for him. The others remained standing around him, a silent guard of honor. Amos watched the man, whose name he would learn was Chaitan, and felt the first flicker of understanding. They were not here to harm him, they were here because of him. Hunger and the sheer, pressing weight of their expectation finally broke his paralysis. He could not stay barricaded forever. To do so would be an act of fear and insult, and whatever was happening here, he knew it was a moment of great gravity. With a deep, shuddering breath, he slid the bar from the door. The wood groaned in protest. He stepped out into the cold, bright air, blinking. He did not look at them directly, not at first. He walked to his woodpile, his movements deliberate, and began to build a fire in the stone-lined pit in the center of the yard. He did not have much to offer, but he could offer warmth against the creeping cold. It was an invitation, a gesture of peace. As the first flames licked at the dry kindling, Chaitan rose and walked toward him. He moved with a slow, measured grace, his feet seeming to barely disturb the ground. He stopped a few feet from the fire, his gaze finally meeting Amos's. It was not a hostile look. It was searching, ancient, and deeply intelligent. "The wind told us of a shot fired in defense of the sacred," Chaitan said. His voice was low and resonant, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a river. It spoke of a man with an empty gun and a full heart. Amos swallowed, his throat dry. He could only nod, feeling a profound foolishness in trying to explain the impulse that had driven him. Words felt inadequate, clumsy tools for such a moment. Chaitan's eyes flickered to the cabin. "The people of the 7 council fires have come. The white buffalo calf is the return of a promise from Wakantanka. Its coming heralds a time of great change. To protect it is to honor the Creator. The ground where such an act occurred must be blessed." Amos didn't understand all the words, but he understood the intent. He was not being accused, he was being honored in a way that left him deeply unsettled and humbled. He stepped back from the fire, a silent granting of permission. He watched as the other holy men approached. They were not looking at him now, but at his home, the small, lonely cabin that had been his prison of grief for so long. What followed was something outside of Amos's entire life experience. The air, which moments before had been still and tense, began to hum with a new energy. One of the men brought out a bundle of sage, lighting it from the fire Amos had built. The smoke, thick and aromatic, was fanned with an eagle's wing, washing over the log walls of the cabin, over the door, over Amos himself. Chaitan began to chant, a series of low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from the very earth beneath his feet. The others joined in, their voices weaving a complex tapestry of prayer. They painted symbols on his doorframe with red ochre circles, lightning bolts, the shape of a buffalo. They were marking his home, claiming it not for themselves, but for the spirits. Amos stood to the side, a stranger at his own ceremony. The smell of burning sage and sweetgrass filled his lungs, and the rhythmic chanting vibrated deep in his bones. It was a language his mind could not comprehend, but his soul, that long neglected and barren thing, seemed to recognize it. It was a language of reverence, of sorrow, and of a power that was deeply and inextricably tied to the land he stood upon. Later, as dusk began to purple the edges of the sky, they shared food. It was not his meager supply of salted pork and hardtack, but theirs. They produced smoked bison tongue, dried choke cherries mixed with tallow, and a type of bread made from ground roots. They offered it to him first. He took it, his hand trembling slightly, and ate. The silence around the fire was no longer one of suspicion, but of communion. In the faces of these men, illuminated by the flickering firelight, Amos saw something he recognized. Beneath the foreign paint and the alien ceremony, he saw a profound grief that mirrored his own. He saw the sorrow of a people who had lost so much, a people watching their world vanish before their eyes. That shared wound, deeper than any cultural divide, became a bridge across the chasm of their differences. He found himself speaking, the words coming out cracked and hesitant. "I lost my wife and my boy." He pointed to 2 simple wooden crosses on a small hillock behind the cabin. "Years ago, the fever." He hadn't spoken their names aloud in 5 years. Chaitan looked toward the graves, his expression softening with an empathy that needed no translation. He did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound understanding. "The spirits of our ancestors walk with us in our sorrow," he said softly. "They are not gone. They have only changed worlds. Your act has honored them as it has honored ours." That night, Amos did not sleep in his bed. He sat by the fire with the holy men, wrapped in a gifted robe, listening to their quiet murmuring and the endless song of the wind. For the first time since Martha's death, the silence did not feel empty. It felt full. His small, isolated patch of land no longer felt like the edge of the world. It felt like its very center. He was beginning to understand that the bullet he had fired had not just saved a life, it had bought back his own. The sacred rites continued through the cool, star-dusted night and into the next day. A new sense of peace had settled over the clearing, a palpable tranquility that seemed to soak into the very soil. The air was clean, the world felt newly washed. As the shamans were preparing for their final prayers, a discordant sound intruded, the jingle of harnesses and the angry crunch of hooves on stony ground. Garrett Vance and his two companions reappeared at the edge of the trees. They had returned, and this time they had brought their rage with them, stoked by cheap whiskey and wounded pride. Their eyes, bloodshot and malevolent, took in the scene. The gathered holy men, the painted symbols on the cabin, the old trapper standing not as a victim, but as a participant. Their prejudiced minds could only process the sight in one way. "Well, look at that." Vance sneered, his voice thick with contempt. "The old goat fell in with them. I bet they're paying you, ain't they, old man? A reward for that white hide." He spat on the ground. "We've come to collect our share, and to levy a tax for consorting with savages." They dismounted, their rifles held loosely but ready. Their presence was a violation, a profane intrusion into a hallowed space. The chanting stopped. The holy men turned as one, their faces impassive, their stillness an unbreachable wall of dignity. They held no weapons, only their sacred pipes and prayer staffs. Their silence was more intimidating than any war cry. Before Chaitan or any of the others could move or speak, Amos stepped forward. He moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years, placing his body directly between Garrett Vance and the elders. His own Sharp's rifle, still unloaded, was leaning against the cabin wall, a silent testament to the choice he had already made. He was weaponless, and in that moment, more powerful than he had ever been. "There is nothing here for you," Amos said. His voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, cutting through the tense air. "This is consecrated ground now. You need to turn around and leave." Vance let out a short, ugly laugh. "Consecrated? By them?" He gestured dismissively with his rifle barrel at the silent holy men. "This is nothing but dirt and wood, old man. We'll consecrate it with your blood if you don't step aside." He raised the rifle, leveling it at Amos's chest. Amos did not flinch. He did not move. He simply held Vance's gaze, his pale blue eyes unwavering. "No," he said. The word was small, but it was absolute. It was the summation of a life of loss, of a decade of isolation, and of 2 days of profound, world-altering connection. He was no longer just Amos Blackwood, a man with nothing to lose. He was a man who had finally found something he would not allow to be defiled. He was protecting the first glimmer of peace he had known in a decade. Behind him, Chaitan began to chant again. It was not the prayerful, welcoming sound from before. This was different. It was a low, resonant drone that seemed to thrum up from the soles of his feet, a sound that spoke of mountains and thunder and the immense, unyielding power of the earth. The other shamans joined in, their voices layering into a chord of formidable spiritual authority. It was not a song of war, it was a song of presence, a declaration that they stood on land that answered to a power far older and greater than the men with guns. Vance's two companions began to shift uneasily. This was not the simple shakedown they had envisioned. The old man's unnerving calm, his lack of a weapon, the eerie, vibrating chant, and the collective, condemning stare of the 7 holy men began to unravel their drunken courage. It felt wrong. It felt dangerous in a way they did not understand. "Shoot him, Garrett," one of them urged, but his voice was thin, all the bluster gone. "Let's just get this over with." But Garrett Vance hesitated. His finger tightened on the trigger, but he could not pull it. He looked into Amos's eyes and saw not an easy victim, but a guardian. He saw a man who had already passed through the worst the world could offer and had come out the other side, anchored to something Vance could not see, touch, or bully. In that moment of hesitation, the illusion of his power shattered. He was just a man with a gun, and he was facing something that bullets could not kill. With a frustrated, guttural curse, Vance lowered his rifle. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the words were hollow, an empty echo of his earlier bravado. He shoved his way back to his horse, his companions scrambling to follow. They mounted and rode away, not in a gallop of triumph, but in a hurried, graceless retreat, fleeing a battle they had lost without a single shot being fired. In the clearing, a new silence descended. It was the quiet of a storm that has passed, leaving the air clean and charged with ozone. The chanting faded, and the world seemed to settle back onto its foundation. Chayton walked to Amos and placed a firm, warm hand on his shoulder. "A man's spirit is not measured by the weapons he carries," the old shaman said, his dark eyes filled with a deep, abiding respect. "It is measured by the ground he is willing to stand upon. The Great Spirit sees your heart, Amos Blackwood. This place," he swept his hand to encompass the small cabin and the yard, "is now Wakan. It is a holy place, and you are its protector." As the day drew to a close, the shamans prepared to depart. They moved with the same quiet dignity with which they had arrived. Before they left, they came to Amos one by one. They did not give him payments, they gave him gifts of kinship. A thick, warm buffalo robe painted with the story of the white calf. A parfleche case filled with enough smoked meat and dried berries to last for months. A bundle of sacred tobacco and a pipe with a bowl carved from red pipestone. These were not transactions, they were acknowledgments. He was no longer an outsider. Amos stood by his newly marked door and watched them mount their ponies. He watched as the 7 holy men, representatives of a world he had only ever seen from a fearful distance, rode away, melting back into the vast landscape from which they had emerged. He was alone again, but the nature of his solitude had been fundamentally transformed. He turned and looked at his small cabin. It was no longer just a collection of logs and mud that held the ghosts of his past. The strange, beautiful symbols on the doorframe were a promise. The lingering scent of sage was a blessing. The cabin was no longer a refuge from the world, but a connection to its very soul. Later, as the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the night sky, Amos sat by his fire. The useless, empty Sharp's rifle still leaned by the door, and he felt no urge to reload it. The profound, aching loneliness that had been his shadow for so many years had receded, replaced by a deep, quiet sense of purpose. He had found his home, not in the 4 walls of his dwelling, but in the peace he had been chosen to protect. Winter was coming, a season of brutal, killing cold. But for the first time in a very long time, Amos Blackwood was not afraid. The fire in his hearth burned bright, and for the first time, it felt like it was warming more than just his body. It was warming his soul.